In this Magic the Gathering Foundations limited set review, I'm going to be going through the cards, discussing them, and helping you evaluate them so that you'll be ready for the format. Disclaimer, I will not be discussing every card in the set. Instead, I will evaluate a sizable number of cards to help you learn how to approach the set yourself. This will be more valuable and help you learn how to fish yourself. It's just going to be a better use of everybody's time. Kicking things off with our first card, we're going to be talking about one of the gold signpost uncommons. Now, this is the one for blue-white. It's a 3-mana 2/3 flyer that gives other creatures with flying +1/+1. Now, the great thing about this card is that it's really good in a blue-white flyers deck, but it's not the sort of card that is going to get poached by other decks, which means that if other decks are trying to splash cards, Empyrean Eagle is not going to be that high on their list because this really wants to come down on curve, buff some of your creatures, and be a really good card in that blue-white home. Now, if you have even a couple of other flyers, this card's going to be excellent, but even with no other flyers, a 3-mana 2/3 is totally fine to play in your decks and is going to be quite solid. So keep that in mind. If you have other flyers, which your blue-white decks are going to do, this card is going to be great because making your other flyers bigger is going to help you race in the air, which is often what your flying decks want to do. But if you are early in pack 1, you don't have to overcommit for this card. It's not the sort of thing that single-handedly takes over the game. Just wait till you're kind of in blue-white or leaning towards blue-white and then pick this card up. Next is Balmor, Battle Mage Captain. It is a 2-mana 1/3 flyer, which is a little bit lower in terms of the stat lines. It doesn't really chip in for damage quite as well, but it does buff up your entire team when you cast instants and sorceries, which is absolutely excellent. This is, again, not the sort of card that's going to be splashed very often because you want to be able to cast your 2-drops on turn 2, so it's not a great splash candidate because splash cards often are going to be the cards that you want to be casting in the late game. And while Balmor is still solid in the late game, you really need that upside of casting him on turn 2. But when you are able to get this into your blue-red deck, it is absolutely excellent. This is a card that you want to prioritize, and it will really make your deck hum along. You need to have plenty of instants and sorceries, but also plenty of creatures in play to buff up with your Balmor. So one thing that you'll want to do if you have Balmor in your deck or in play is try to avoid trades if you can, because you're going to be able to push through massive amounts of damage and help race your opponent. So if you have the option to trade 2/2 creatures or keep an extra 2/2 in play on your side of the battlefield, you should probably not make that trade if you have a Balmor, because your 2/2 creature is going to hit them for 3 or 4 damage instead of just the 2 damage, so you'll win that race. Balmor, definitely worth an early speculative pick, but again, not the sort of card that you have to go all in on right off the bat. Now we're going to talk about some monocolored commons, just kind of get the lay of the land of the set. We've already kind of seen how you can evaluate the uncommons, especially the gold ones. We'll come back to some more uncommons later. Helpful Hunter, 2 mana for a 1/1. When it enters, draw a card. Very straightforward design. We've seen this almost exact same card printed before in the past, and it has been quite good. In other sets, there were some extra synergies going on with those cards. In this set, there's going to be some cards that really like having this around. If you have cards that sacrifice creatures, this does a good job of being sacrifice fodder. If you have cards that buff other creatures, this is really nice because turning your 1/1 into a 2/2, all of a sudden that gets to trade with real cards from your opponent. Basically, the fact that it's so cheap to play and you actually just get like a body and a card back for 2 mana makes this a really excellent card that you're going to want to prioritize because it will make all of your decks hum along. Another added bonus is it does draw you towards your best card. So if you have like a very, very great, like strong card in your deck, this will help draw you towards it by just being a nice cantripping creature. It's a speed bump. It's not the best in an aggressive shell typically because you want your 2-drop creatures to be able to attack for 2 or even 3 damage sometimes in your aggressive decks, but it's just the sort of card you're going to be happy to have in most of your white decks. The next card is one that you are going to want to have in your white decks, and that is Felidar Savior. It is the perfect card to have at the top end of your curve. It's a 4-mana 2/3, but it comes into play and puts +1/+1 counters on each of up to 2 other target creatures you control. Now, this other is really, really important. It means that you can't buff the Felidar Savior itself, but you can buff 2 of your other creatures, which is really going to help those creatures swing in for damage. So if you have a 2/2 and a 3/3, all of a sudden you have a 3/3 and a 4/4. You really want to go 2-drop, 3-drop Felidar Savior, be able to attack with both of your guys, and that's what Felidar Savior enables. It's the sort of card that thrives in more aggressive decks because those are the decks that have a lot of creatures. If you're playing a more controlling deck, you might have fewer creatures, which makes it harder to use the Felidar Savior. And also a controlling deck, it's worth keeping in mind, will often have to trade off its creatures when it's blocking. So you play your 2-drop creature, your opponent plays a 2-drop creature. If you're a control deck, you're going to be trading when your opponent attacks you. You're not going to try to save your creature generally to buff it up with the Felidar Savior just so it can continue to sit back. So Felidar Savior is going to thrive in aggressive decks, but it is really, really good in racing situations because it helps you swing the race by pushing lots of damage, and also being a life linker is quite nice. So this is the sort of card that is going to be a high priority for your white aggressive decks. A lot of the time white decks are aggressive in general, and Felidar Savior is going to be a good piece of that. Next is Refute. This is a blue card that is not the greatest, in my opinion. The problem with a 3-mana counterspell is if you don't have something else to do with your mana, your opponent can sometimes just pass the turn and cast an instant on your turn. Sometimes they'll have an activated ability. Sometimes they'll just like equip a creature to their creature. Sometimes they don't even have to do anything because they're ahead in the game and don't need to cast their spells right away. And so Refute is the sort of card that can get stuck in your hand. Now, countering a spell and drawing a card and discarding a card is certainly an upside. It's the sort of thing that you'll want to keep in mind when you have this card in your deck. Definitely keep an extra land in your hand so you can draw and discard that land if you do draw the Refute. And it's not the sort of card that's going to do nothing. And it also is worth noting that this gets better in sealed. So if you are playing in a sealed format, which is slower, where you're going to make sure you have to have more answers in your deck for your opponent's creatures, Refute does get a little bit better there. And it also gets better the more instants that you have in your deck. So if you can pass your turn 3 with Refute, but also another instant to play if your opponent doesn't cast a spell that you need to counter, that's where Refute really shines. So you may have noticed I started by saying this card isn't great. It's not the sort of card that you'll want in a lot of your blue decks, but then I spent a lot of time talking about the situations where you would want the card. And so that's the sort of thing that you need to keep in mind when you're looking at these cards that are maybe mediocre or maybe not the best. Think about the situations where you would want the card, but still remember that a lot of the time you aren't going to want the card. Another problem with Refute, just as a closing note, is that it's a reactive instant in sorcery. So as we already saw with the Balmor Battle Mage, you have this blue-red deck that cares about casting instants and sorceries, but being able to do that proactively, like casting an instant speed removal spell or a sorcery removal spell that like will let you trigger your cards that care about it when you want to trigger them, that's the sort of thing that's also valuable. So just things to keep in mind with Refute, not really a high priority as a result. Next is Think Twice. This is the sort of card that can really shine if you do have those sort of Balmor decks where you just want to trigger him multiple times. Think Twice will be able to be cast multiple times to trigger multiple instants and sorceries matters cards. There is something to be said as well for the fact that it has flashback, which means if you can get it into your graveyard without actually casting it, that's a nice little advantage as well. So if you're going to be trying to play Think Twice, try to think of the cases where you can get more than just the face value for the card, because spending 5 to draw 2 cards, even though it is split up, which makes it significantly better than just a 5-mana draw 2 would be, it's still not the greatest, because 5 mana to draw 2 cards, I mean, you can get card advantage in innumerable ways that aren't Think Twice. The way to take advantage of this is if you're triggering your effects, if you're able to mill Think Twice, if you have like discard effects, so you can discard Think Twice to flash it back. These are all ways that you can almost make the card a little bit freer to have, so you just have a 3-mana way to draw an extra card when you need one, and those are the spots where Think Twice is really going to shine. So not a high priority, but definitely the sort of thing that can slot into the deck if you have right synergy around it. Next is Crypt Feaster. This is just a pretty straightforward card. 4 mana for a 3/4 menace is just not the greatest stat line. In the late game, if it is able to attack and you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard, it's going to be a 5/4 menace. But generally the way you want to think about these threshold cards is as a card on its face value, what's it going to do when I play it? And then if you do get to the late game, does it do something absolutely crazy? And this card does scale with the game. A 5/4 menace is certainly better than a 3/4 menace, but it doesn't get the buff on blocks. It only gets it if it is attacking. And a 4 mana 3/4 menace is just not really an acceptable card. So this is not a priority and not one you're going to want to take highly. Now we're moving on to red here. There aren't as many black commons or red commons, but we will make up for that by talking about an extra uncommon for each of those colors. Burst Lightning, though, is very, very special. This card is excellent. 1 mana deal 2 to any target is really just the rate that you would expect, and that's already a solid card. But this card is absolutely incredible because you get an extra ability on this card to play 5 mana total, so 1 plus the kicker of 4, to be able to deal 4 damage instead. And the fact that this says any target is certainly significant. If your opponent gets to 4 life, they all of a sudden have to be worried about losing to a Burst Lightning. It's really nice to be able to kill an early threat or kill a late game threat or threaten your opponent's life total. Those are all really nice options to have. And Burst Lightning, especially at instant speed, is going to be a really, really great card and one you're going to want to pick highly. Definitely one to keep an eye out for in a premium common. Next is Llanowar Elves. This is the sort of card that you need to think carefully about how highly you want to take it for your deck, because it can be a bit of a liability in the late game if you top deck it, because a 1/1 doesn't really do much in combat and is essentially going to function as a land. Now, Llanowar Elves still does a lot of good work if you drop it early in the game, and it does tend to pair really well if you have some sort of mid-rangey card advantage to pair it with, or some really powerful threats to get onto the battlefield early. So Llanowar Elves is going to thrive in decks where you can go play Llanowar Elves, and then on turn 2 play like a 3/3, and then on turn 3 play like a 4/4. So you're like essentially a turn ahead of the curve, and you kill your opponent before the fact that you spent a mana on a Llanowar Elves doesn't really matter. Another spot where it's going to be good is if you play Llanowar Elves and then you use it to ramp out some defenses, and then play a card draw spell, so you're kind of making up for the Llanowar Elves, and it essentially gave you an extra land. The games where it's not going to be great are the decks where you're just trying to maybe assemble some synergies, but your cards aren't starting out very big. So maybe you're trying to play like a tokens deck that all of your individual cards aren't the biggest. Honestly, Llanowar Elves is just pretty good in general, just because of the fact that you can play it on turn 1. I feel like I'm talking about the downsides a little bit too much of drawing it in the late game, but it is certainly relevant. Generally, you'll want this in most of your green decks. It's going to be able to just accelerate you enough. But keep in mind that if your deck is mostly 2-drops, it's not really going to do what you want it to do. Sure, getting that one turn where you play 2-drops in a turn is nice, but generally you won't like usually cut it from the deck, but you will maybe lower it in your pick order if you are playing those sorts of decks where you don't have top end and you're just trying to end the game, because a 1/1 doesn't really do much if you are trying to attack or block as much. But yeah, Llanowar Elves, great card, definitely good for a lot of these mid-ranging controlling decks that have a lot of card advantage, or just the ones that are trying to accelerate out big threats to end the game. Just maybe not the best in your deck that has 10 2-drops or something like that, which does happen sometimes. Next is Giant Growth, a nice simple combat trick. These are never really a priority in the drafting portion. And the reason for that is that one combat trick functions very similar to another in draft most of the time. You'll have access to these cards. You don't generally want to run too many of them, and you'll see them relatively late in the packs because other players also realize that they can't run too many of them. Giant Growth is nice and efficient, +3/+3 for 1 mana, can protect your creature from burn spells, can sometimes push damage out of nowhere, but generally you're going to be using this in combat to kill one of your opponent's creatures very efficiently. It's also worth noting that you don't really want combat tricks as much in your controlling decks, because you want to be able to use combat tricks when your opponent is tapped out and can't use an instant speed removal spell in response or things of that nature. You do not want to be using these defensively. You want to be using these aggressively to push damage. So keep that in mind. Giant Growth has the kind of narrow home of just being good in your aggressive green decks, but when you do have that deck, you can run a copy and it can do some good work. Next is Cat Collector. So we're getting to some of the uncommons. Cat Collector is a really cool card. One of the things to keep in mind is if something generates multiple cards or multiple, like sometimes it's called square theory, where you generate multiple, or rectangle theory, sorry, where you generate multiple rectangles. So your Cat Collector comes into play and it brings a food token along with it. That's generally like a nice thing to do, because you just generally are able to find a use for the cards that these things are generating, or the pieces of cardboard as they're sometimes referred to. So Cat Collector is a 3-mana 3/2, which is reasonable stats, not great though, but it comes into play with a food, and then when you gain life for the first time each turn, you can make a 1/1 cat creature. So if you play this in the mid game when you already are able to sacrifice the food, you can play like a 5-mana 3/2, get the 1/1 cat immediately, gain some life. It's just a really nice card that has good synergy if you have other life gain in your deck. And this is the sort of card that is good on its own, but also slots nicely into those decks and helps you build a board state. It's also worth noting, it's always good to check with these cards on their conditions. So it says when you gain life for the first time during each of your turns, which means that you can only trigger it once each turn, but you can trigger it during your opponent's turn. So if you say have your Cat Collector in play and gain life on your turn from something like a lifelink creature, which we already saw one of those as the 4-drop in white that we looked at earlier. So Cat Collector, you play that, maybe you gain a couple of life, and then you sacrifice the food on your opponent's turn, you can double up on the cats, which is really, really good as well. This card looks like an early pick for sure, and definitely one that your mid-rangey and your controlling white decks are going to be interested in. It's also worth noting that if you're playing like a blue-white Flyers deck, this card can really shine as well, because blue-white Flyers decks often look to race in the air, and Cat Collector gains you life and also makes 1/1 tokens that can help stabilize you on the ground or chump block for a while. Next is Stroke of Midnight. I do want to highlight some dud cards in addition to some of the really cool cards we've been looking at. Stroke of Midnight is the sort of card that you should not be playing in your drafts. The problem with Stroke of Midnight is that you have to kill your opponent's creatures, a lot of the time with this, that are not going to be necessarily that much better than a 1/1 creature will be. So for example, you're getting attacked by your opponent's like 3/3 flyer. Turning that into a 1/1 is certainly a downgrade, but you spent 3 mana and a card to turn your opponent's creature into another creature that still has usefulness. We've already talked about some of the uses of 1/1s when we talked about cards earlier, but you can put equipment on them, you can use them for chump blocking, you can use them for double blocking and all of that stuff. And turning your opponent's creatures into 1/1 creatures is just going to give them too much of a resource, especially when you're spending 3 mana for that privilege. Sure, that can kill other non-land permanents, which means maybe it's the sort of thing that you sideboard in if your opponent has a non-land permanent that you just have no other answers for and you have to have an answer for, but generally that's just not strong enough to be worth picking in the draft, and it's the card that you should not be playing because it's going to leave you in a bad spot when you're casting it. Next is Klinquant Sky Mage. Klinquant. Interesting. That's a fun word, let's just say. Despite their advanced intellect, some Aven never quite shake their instinctive need to collect shiny baubles. Don't know why I felt compelled to read the flavor text on that one, but I do not regret it. 4 mana for a 1/1. That's the first thing you should be thinking when you see this card. It's 4 mana for a 1/1 flyer, which means regardless of the fact that it's going to grow over time as you draw cards, you're starting off with a huge tempo loss. What do I mean by that? You can't really block with this the turn it comes into play. It also doesn't really block well the second turn it comes into play, or even the third turn it comes into play, because even a 4 mana 3/3 flyer is not really going to be your ideal blocker. If you pair this with other card draw, though, that's where it can maybe start to shine. Still, it's 4 mana for a 1/1 flyer. You always have to keep that baseline in mind, because if you are trying to play a reasonable game of Magic where both players are playing creatures and spells and interacting, if you spend 4 mana for a 1/1 worth of stats, you are going to fall behind, which means you need to have ways to recover from that downside. And the thing that Klinquant Sky Mage wants you to do is play the Klinquant and then play card draw. And if you play the Klinquant and then you play card draw, if your opponent kills the Klinquant or something like, I just keep saying it, the Sky Mage, if you play the Sky Mage and your opponent kills it, then when in response to your card draw, then you spent your turn 4 doing very little, playing a very fragile threat, and then you spent your turn 5 playing like a card draw spell or something of that nature, and all of a sudden you are in a world of hurt. Klinquant Sky Mage is really, really tough to use effectively. You will want to pair it with card draw if you are going to be playing it, because 4 mana for a 1/1 that just grows very slowly is not really a card that you can afford to play most of the time. And as a control finisher, it doesn't even do that well, because you really want your control finishers to also have some utility when you're behind, which is what control decks often are. If your control deck is falling behind, you don't really want to be playing a 4 mana 1/1, because that doesn't help stabilize you. You'd much rather have something consistent like a 5 mana 4/4 flyer, or something that has some base stats that can actually stop ground attackers. The other problem is if you're an aggressive deck, you want cards that push your advantage. You don't want to be playing a 4 mana 1/1 that gives your opponent a couple of turns to buy some time to maybe find their removal spells to stabilize the ground, to deal with your other permanents, and then become a threat. You want to have cards that are threatening immediately. So you want to play like a 4 mana 3/3 flyer, so you can actually threaten for some damage. So this is kind of a card without a home in that regard, because it doesn't fit great in control decks or aggressive decks. I do not expect this to be a high priority. If you do have a bunch of card draw in your deck, even then you'd probably rather just win with the card advantage you get from the card draw rather than trying to stabilize after playing a Sky Mage. So despite the flavor text, despite the fact that it is collecting a lot of shiny objects, probably a card you should leave on the sidelines. Next is Faebloom Trick. This card is actually quite nice. So instead of getting one 1/1 flyer for 4 mana, you get 2 1/1 flyers for 3 mana. Now that's not quite fair to the Klinquant Sky Mage. Never going to forget that card's name. But Faebloom Trick is the sort of card that you would like to have in your control deck. So for 3 mana, you play this on your opponent's turn, you tap their biggest attacker, you buy yourself some time. You make 2 1/1 fairy tokens with flying. Those can pressure your opponent. Those can combine on double blocks. Those can chump block. Those can do all sorts of things. They can pressure your opponent. They can play really well with the card that buffed both of your flyers for +1/+1. All of a sudden, you have 3 2/2 flyers, which is just excellent. This card is going to perform great. It's also good with the counterspell in blue, as we already talked about. It's an instant that you can use if you are holding up your mana with the counterspell, and then you just play the Faebloom Trick if your opponent doesn't do something you want to counter. So overall, the Trick is a really nice card, and definitely the sort of thing that is good in your aggressive decks, your control decks. I mean, if you're playing an aggressive deck, you can even just play this to tap down your opponent's blocker. That's not something I mentioned before, but this card just does it all, fits into a lot of strategies, and that's something you want to keep in mind when you are evaluating cards. thinking about where they fit. Does it fit into aggressive decks? Does it fit into control decks? Because that's one of the key questions with Fey Bloom Trick. It answers those questions. It checks those boxes. It's good when you're ahead because it taps their blockers. It's good when you're behind. It taps their attackers. It's good when you're aggressive because it has evasive creatures. It's good when you're behind. It makes chump blockers. It just kind of does it all. And a card that can perform so well on so many metrics is definitely worth a high pick. Next is Midnight Snack. We're going to be going through some of the black cards now. Midnight Snack is just not a great card. So raid means that you have to have an attacking creature, and you can then create a food token. So 3 mana, and if you had an attacker, you create food tokens, which don't directly help you enable future attacks. That's just something to keep in mind. So you're able to attack your opponent, you play your 3-drop, all of a sudden you get a food token, which doesn't really facilitate future attacks. And then you can spend 3 mana to sacrifice it and have an opponent lose X life or X the amount of life you gained this turn. So I guess if you have, like, say, a 1/1 flyer or something that lets you attack every turn, and then you get to turn 7, you can crack 2 foods and sacrifice this enchantment for the remaining 3 mana to deal 6 to your opponent. So it's just the sort of card that doesn't affect the board. And one thing you always need to think about when you are evaluating a card like Midnight Snack is, what if I am behind? And then in the cases where you're behind, this card does stone nothing. You're not going to be able to have the 3 mana to sacrifice it. You're not going to be able to attack your opponent to get foods. And in those cases, you are just going to be absolutely appalled to see Midnight Snack in your hand. So this is just the sort of card you should not run. It's a trap card. And if you end up in a situation where you really need food tokens, you should probably still not run this card, because some games, and by some games, I mean pretty much half of the games, you're going to be on the draw. And by pretty much half the games, I mean exactly half the games, unless you're doing something shady, or if your opponent is choosing to be on the draw for some reason. So I guess I should keep it nebulous. But still, if you're on the draw, you play this as your 3-drop when you just really need a blocker, you're just going to get steamrolled. And that's just not a spot where you want to be. So keep Midnight Snack out of your decks, generally speaking, though. Yeah, just avoid this one. Next is Vengeful Blood Witch. This is the sort of card that is understated. So 2 mana 1/1 is just not great stats. We already saw a 2 mana 1/1 that drew a card to replace itself. And so you really actually have to look at the ability to make sure this card is worth it in your deck. And whenever this creature or another creature you control, so it's worth noting, it doesn't include your opponent's creatures, dies, and a target opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So this can definitely do some work in a sacrifice deck if you can get some tokens running around, if you can get some fodder running around, if you have an engine going where you like make a 1/1, sacrifice a 1/1, make a 1/1, sacrifice a 1/1, those sorts of things. All of a sudden you're able to get significant amounts of life. But at the end of the day, you're getting a 2 mana 1/1, which means this card is hard to use and narrow, because a lot of decks won't be able to fulfill the requirements. A lot of decks are trying to get to the late game, try to play the control game, and a control deck does not want a 2 mana 1/1 that does not replace itself, because those 2 mana, this guy's not going to be able to block or trade in combat very effectively. The aggressive decks want, as we already established, attackers that are bigger than 1/1s. This card fits into that narrow band of mid-range decks that have sacrifice fodder or have ways to generate advantage with this other than creatures naturally dying in combat. And so the Blood Witch can do some work, but it's not a high pick because it is so narrow. Next is Zombify. I told you we'd get to some extra black cards to make up for the lack of the commons. Zombify is 4 mana to return a creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. The problem is, by the time you get to turn 4, there's not often a great card in your graveyard to return. It's just a little bit finicky to use, and it only targets creatures in your graveyard, so you can't even kill your opponent's best thing and bring those back. 4 mana is still definitely a chance to get a mana advantage, because sometimes you'll be able to get like a 6-drop in your graveyard, or a 7-drop even, if you have like some self-mill in your deck or things of that nature. But the problem with this card is that if you draw it in the early turns, it can just be a blank. If you're trying to be a control deck, as we've already talked about, this is just kind of the repetition that hopefully helps you evaluate these cards yourself. But if you're trying to be an aggressive deck, Zombify is not really where you want to be, because you're going to be attacking your opponent, and then your 4-drop is getting back a card that costs less than 4 mana because you're curving out. You're the only cards in your graveyard are your 2-drop and your 3-drop if they trade it off even. And you don't want to have a blank card in your aggressive deck. So you think, okay, if I'm playing a mid-range deck, I can get back my key threat that dies in the mid-game. That's where the Zombify thrives. That's where it's going to be good. You're playing a grindy battle, your opponent kills your 5/5 flyer or something like that, and then you Zombify, boom, you have a second copy of it. That's where it can actually do something really nice. And then in the control decks, if you are playing a dedicated control deck, you can oftentimes just get your card advantage and win the game with whatever you have left standing, and you don't really need to rely on a Zombify to do that, because you just have so much card advantage that you're burying your opponent with whichever threats you have, killing all their creatures, things like that, once you've stabilized. So Zombify doesn't help you stabilize. but it can help you in these grindy decks. Not really a high priority as a result because of that narrow use case and the fact that you kind of have to have a good creature you want to get back, and some decks don't even really have that. A lot of decks would rather just play another big creature. So if you just have the option, like Zombify is sometimes the best thing it's getting back in your entire deck is like a 4/4, you can just play another 4/4 instead of Zombify. And so you don't really need to necessarily deal with these finicky cards that don't always do what you need them to do. They're like unreliable, and the payoff isn't really worth it a lot of the time. So not a high pick. Next is Battle Song Berserker, 4 mana for a 3/4, so a little bit understated, but when you attack, target creature gets +1/+0 and Menace. So this card can be a 4/4 Menace attacker for 4, which is a totally solid card. A 4/4 is often going to require a double block and often be able to kill the 2 creatures double blocking it, so that's really, really nice. Also, being able to turn your other creatures into menacers, that's kind of one of the use cases for those 1/1s, because turning a 1/1 randomly into a 2/1 menace, all of a sudden it's kind of hard to block, and it's going to trade with your opponent's creature unless they have 2 creatures that are bigger than two toughness. So all of a sudden those 1/1s are looking a lot better, and that's kind of why those cards are always going to have value, where if you kill your opponent's 3/3 flyer and turn it into a 1/1 with that card we already looked at in white, that Midnight Mayhem or whatever it's called, not Midnight Mayhem, that's a different card, the Stroke of Midnight or whatever it's called, the Cinderella looking card. But basically those cards that give your opponent 1/1s, all of a sudden if they have like a Battle Song Berserker in play or they just play one, you're going to be in trouble. And this card is really, really nice. Being able to buff up your small creatures is great. Menace is a great ability for attacking, which is what this card wants. And overall, this is going to be a high pick. It's the perfect curve topper for your deck. You get to trigger it the turn it comes into play. And this is the sort of card where, again, if you examine every card, they don't always have to do well on every single category, like that blue uncommon we looked at. This card isn't great in your control deck, because in your control deck, you're not really attacking quite as much. If you are playing an aggressive deck, though, this card does exactly what you want. And so sometimes it's good to have a more niche card that does exactly what you want than a card that's like kind of bad or mediocre in all categories. And so that's kind of where Battle Song Berserker, it's going to really thrive in your aggressive decks. And so keep that in mind. Also worth noting that red is an aggressive color generally. Shivan Dragon has been made an uncommon in this set. Kind of hurts my soul a little bit to see that, but also at the same time, it means more people are going to get to have the experience of playing with this card, which is quite cool, and it's an iconic card, so I'm actually happy that more people are going to get to see it instead of it just being a relic of the past. I mean, I've gotten to play with it before, but we're waxing on instead of talking about the card. 6 mana for a 5/5 flyer that can pump itself to end the game in a hurry. By the time you have 6 mana, you're often going to have 3 or maybe even 4 red mana if you are a heavy red deck. So this card comes down, it can block most things, and then it can attack and hit your opponent for like 9 damage. Now, it doesn't come associated with any value, but if you have your opponent at a reasonable life total, so you've hit them a few times, you've gotten them to like 12, this is going to end the game in a couple of turns, and that is a really formidable thing. Now, the problem is it costs 6 mana, but that's the sort of thing that you can mitigate by just having like maybe 1 6-drop in your deck. Aggressive decks tend to want to be low to the ground so they don't waste their plays, waste space in their hand with expensive cards that they can't play. But this is the sort of card that in a mid-range red deck, or even as just a single finisher in a red deck, can definitely get the job done. And I feel obligated to say that it's probably not like a first pick quality card like it would have been in the past. You'd probably rather have like efficient removal spells and things like that over it, but it is one heck of a finisher in your red decks, because as I said, if you hit your opponent with this, you're often going to be able to pump it quite a few times and deal a bunch of damage. Now, one thing to note with this sort of card is you don't always have to pump it for the max if you think your opponent might have something. Sometimes your opponent's trying to bait you into pumping it. So you can be like, okay, I'll attack. They can say no blocks, and you can just say damage. And then the damage happens. They can't do anything. Whereas if you say attack, they say no blocks, and you start to pump it, all of a sudden, every time you pump it, they have a chance to kill it in response and make you waste some mana that you could be using deploying other threats. Now, if you have nothing else to deploy, that doesn't really matter. It's often best to just pump it. But if you do have another threat to deploy, keep that in mind. Next is Hidetsugu's Second Right. This card is just super strange. Like, this is one of those cards that in the games where it wins, you're going to feel like someone robbed you. And in the games where it doesn't win you the game, it's going to do so little, because it's hard to get a player's life total to be exactly 10. If you do anything to get it slightly lower, all of a sudden Hidetsugu's Second Right is a complete blank. If you don't have Hidetsugu's Second Right in your hand, what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to stop attacking them once they get to 10 life, hoping to draw the Second Right? Are you supposed to count on your opponent never having life gain spells or a lifelink creature or things like that? This card is just so finicky to use that I'd recommend against playing it in most cases, because there's just too many ways for your opponent to mess with the life totals, and it just puts too much pressure on you if you don't have this card. Or you could just have a classic scenario where you just don't have the tools to deal the exact damage to get them to 10. Like, that is not a given in any way. If you have a 3/3 creature and your opponent's at 12, you can't just like not attack with your 3/3 or just wait until you get a 2/2 that is somehow able to connect with your opponent. And your opponent at that point knows you have the Hidetsugu's second right because you haven't been attacking them with the 3/3, which is just, these are just the things that you should keep in mind with Hidetsugu's second right. It's definitely a wild card that's going to lead to some posterizer moments, but it's not a card that you should be prioritizing or taking highly or putting in your decks. But it's kind of a cool, it's a cool design, and it's a cool reprint for sure. Next is Nessian Hornbeetle. This is definitely a card you should be putting in your decks. It can take over the game in a hurry. At the beginning of your combat, if you have a creature with power 4 or greater, you put a counter on this creature. Now, that does include the Hornbeetle itself. Oh, no, never mind. It does not include the Hornbeetle itself. Reading the card explains the card. If you control another creature with power 4 or greater, so don't just be putting an aura on this and hoping that it'll buff the Hornbeetle. That will not work. But it's not that hard to have a big creature in play by the mid game, and then Nessian Hornbeetle becomes an issue because a 2/2 for 2 is not terrible already. It's already just like mediocre. And then the fact that it can grow into a 3/3 for 2 or a 4/4 or a 5/5 is early as turn 3, it starts to grow. If you have like a 3-mana 4/2 or something like that, all of a sudden your Hornbeetle is doing some work, and this card is really problematic. This is a reprint, and the first time it was seen, it was excellent, and this card is going to be excellent again because it's hard not to be with stats like this. This card is great. Next is Blanchwood Armor. This is a really finicky card and one that you should not put in the majority of your green decks. The only time you really want this card is if you're basically mono green, where you're playing this as like a 3-mana +5/+5, turn your creature into a huge thing and end the game in a hurry. Because if you're giving a creature +3/+3 or something like that in the mid game, then you're not going to be super happy with this. Because in your green-red deck, you're going to have games where you draw 1 forest and 2 mountains, and all of a sudden Blanchwood Armor is completely terrible. And so you really need to have like 12, 13 forests, or maybe even just all forests to make this a card that you'll want to play. And in those cases, you can be like, okay, 3 mana, give my creature +5/+5 when I have 5 lands in play. All of a sudden, we're rumbling. We're going to end the game in 2 turns if my opponent doesn't have an answer. Opening yourself up to a 2-for-1 is never ideal because a 2-for-1 can oftentimes swing the game. A 2-for-1 is when you put a Blanchwood Armor on your creature, your opponent spends 1 card to deal with both your creature and your Blanchwood Armor, and you end up in huge trouble. So I would recommend against playing Blanchwood Armor unless you're experienced drafter playing like a mono green deck, and that is a very niche group of situations to find yourself in. So just generally avoid this card, even if it looks like the sort of thing where in your like mono green deck it could do some work. It definitely can in mono green, but that doesn't happen or very often at all. Next is some of the colorless equipments or colorless cards in the set. Adventuring Gear. This is not a great card in my opinion. So the problem with Adventuring Gear, I say that a lot, the problem with the card. The Adventuring Gear, you play this and then you equip it, and all of a sudden your equipped creatures are getting +2/+2 whenever you play a land. So first thing you need to think about is this card is only good in aggressive decks. It's not going to do anything in your control decks because you're not playing lands on your opponent's turn, and so this is not going to buff your creature stats on your opponent's turn. It's not really great in mid-range decks either because mid-range decks tend to trade off creatures, grind with your opponent, and you don't really want to be in a spot where your equipment only does something if you top deck a land, because that means you're not drawing the spells that you need to actually win the game. And just I guess you could save up lands for when you really need them, but generally it's just too unreliable, and the fact that it's only good in aggressive decks and you need to draw lands at the right times makes this card really, really tricky to use. Also, it opens you not up to a 2-for-1, but almost in some cases, because you generally run out of land drops after a while, and so you play your Adventuring Gear, you spend the mana on it, and then you equip it to a creature, and you get in for like 2 hits, which I guess can sometimes be good enough. So in some aggressive decks, you could consider playing this if you're just, okay, all I want to do is end the game. But if your opponent kills your creature once you've spent the Adventuring Gear and equipped it and then like played a land, all of a sudden you're down not only the mana you spent on the Adventuring Gear and the equip, which the equip is only 1 for sure, but you've also used one of your lands, which means that you don't have unlimited triggers of this. It's not like it gives your creature +2/+2 every turn. You have to have a land to use, and sometimes you can run out of those, or you end up in a spot where, okay, I drew a land, my creature gets +2/+2. It's definitely the sort of thing that can make your small creatures into formidable threats. So I'm not going to say don't play it like I have with some of the cards, but it's generally the sort of card that has a very, very specific home. And if you're going to be on the defensive at all, it's not a card that you're going to want to put into your deck. Next is Fishing Pole, a really weird design, but one that I'm actually kind of into in terms of just the way they designed this card. So basically, the way that this card reads is it's a 1-mana equipment, so you can just fit this into your curve somewhere and then pay 2 to equip. And The way that you then use the card is, first of all, if you have a creature that's able to attack, you can put the fishing pole onto the attacking creature, and then whenever it becomes untapped, never mind, that's not how the card works. It's a confusing card. We'll just be going. We'll go back to the beginning on Fishing Pole. Fishing Pole is a weird card, and even me reading it before making this and reading it now, I've been reading it differently. But basically, you play this card, you equip it to your creature, and then on your opponent's end step, you can pay 1 to tap it, and tap the fishing pole to put a bait counter on the fishing pole. And then when the creature becomes untapped, you can remove a bait counter to make a 1/1 fish creature. So basically, you could just start paying 1 mana and tapping a creature to make a fish every turn, which is definitely kind of the definition of like a mid-range engine piece card. So if you have that card that like rewards you when your creatures die by draining the opponent, Fishing Pole can maybe fit into that deck because that guy doesn't want to tangle in combat, so he might as well be a fisherman instead. The issue with this card is when you pay your Fishing Pole and then you pay the equip and you pay the 1 and tap, and you like try to do that and then your opponent kills the creature, you end up in a spot where you don't get to like make the fish right away. The bait counter will stay, but you don't actually get to make the fish because the equipped creature has to become untapped. But you can then just equip it to a new creature. Hopefully, maybe you have already made a fish or something like that. It's a very finicky, slow card. It's not really what you want in an aggressive deck. It's not a card that you really want in a control deck either, because you don't really necessarily have time to mess around with this when all you're trying to do is stabilize. But in a mid-rangey deck that really needs extra creatures for fodder or sacrifice or to go wide or for synergies, Fishing Pole is the sort of thing that can like be a mirror breaker, be a sideboard card, be the sort of thing that you can play every once in a while. It's definitely a confusing card. I wanted to talk about it because I was like, man, this card is really confusing. And then I, of course, read it and confused myself at the beginning of it. So hopefully that's not adding extra confusion, but I do want to help demonstrate that there are some confusing cards that are worth reading a second time, because that's how Magic the Gathering rolls. The final card we're going to be looking at is Rogue's Passage, and this card looks like free upside to a lot of players. If you're new, you're thinking, oh, I can just replace a basic land with this. All of a sudden, I can make my creature unblockable. And that is good thinking. You should be thinking of ways you can replace your basic lands to get extra upside, especially in the form of dual lands that give you extra colors or things like that. But the problem with Rogue's Passage is that it can lead to games where you get color screwed. So you end up in situations where even in a 9/8 mana base deck, you end up with those games where you draw all forests and no mountains, and you're like, well, I have to mulligan, or all mountains, no forest, or some forests, some mountains, but I can't cast my double red card, or things of that nature. And Rogue's Passage just causes problems in those situations, which means that you don't just want to slot this into any deck. If you have a deck where you think you're going to have trouble closing the game and you think Rogue's Passage is going to really help with that, give you some inevitability, then you can definitely play it, especially if you have easy mana requirements. What does that mean? It means you don't really have double pipped cards. If you do have double pipped cards, you don't have them in both colors. If you do have a situation, maybe you have some extra mana fixing that can help you with that, and maybe then you can include Rogue's Passage. But you don't just want to slot this into your basic deck and hope that it performs well. Also, you don't just want to put this in your deck that's going to like win with flyers, because those creatures are already hard to block. I mean, sure, they might have a reach creature or another flyer sometimes, but you want to make sure that you're just using this in your deck that's like really actually going to struggle to push through. And generally, it's not the sort of card that you're taking highly, because you'd rather put a card that you can definitely play into your early picks versus Rogue's Passage, where sometimes you aren't going to be an aggressive deck. Sometimes you're going to be in a spot where you can't really use this card, especially the control decks where you might think, oh, I'm going to stabilize the game and then sneak through with anything. Control decks generally win by getting card advantage and then winning with whatever they have left after they've dealt with the opponent's threats. You don't win the game by stalling the board and then Rogue's Passaging someone. I mean, you can win the game that way, but it's generally not the way that the control deck wins. It's the way the aggro deck wins, is by the game stalled out and now all of a sudden I have Rogue's Passage where I can spend 4 mana on it every turn and tap it. So it's like 5 mana essentially. And the control deck is spending its mana on casting spells, drawing extra cards, trying to find answers. And that's kind of how that generally plays out. But Rogue's Passage, definitely an interesting card. That is going to do it for this video, though. There is going to be a full card-by-card tier list on the NicolaiBolas Patreon if you want draft grades for every card in Magic Foundations. So look for that once the full set is revealed as well. And also, thank you so much for watching. I do really hope you enjoyed the video. And if you made it to the end, leave hashtag foundational to let me know you made it all the way till the end. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.